Welcome to the Archaeology Studio. Today's episode considers the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. These gardens gained special attention as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Yet, basic questions have been difficult to answer. What did the gardens look like? Who built the gardens? Where and when? What aspects of these gardens were factual versus fictional? The relevant evidence has been interpreted and reinterpreted in many different ways for more than 2,000 years. This video aims to clarify the current state of knowledge about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. In the archaeological record and in the ancient historical records, the Hanging Gardens have been puzzling. From ancient Babylon and generally from Mesopotamia, the abundant cuneiform archives, wall panel inscriptions, and other records have been vague, mysterious, and sometimes frustrating about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Even among the ancient scholars who wrote about these gardens, they wrote with second-hand information, and seemingly none of them actually had visited these particular gardens in person. Generally speaking, gardens were important features of daily life, and especially of royal and religious contexts in ancient Babylon and throughout Mesopotamia. A tree of life was a central symbol in the regional iconography for several hundreds of years. General depictions of gardens were popular not only in Babylon, but also in other famous Mesopotamian cities of the Assyrian kingdom, such as at the cities of Assur, Nimrud, and Nineveh. In fact, for many centuries, the Babylonian and Assyrian traditions of this region had influenced each other. Throughout Mesopotamia, gardens, of course, were made at ground level, where people could use ditches, channels, canals, or aqueducts to deliver the necessary water supplies to their gardens on a regular basis. This technology primarily was applied for agricultural fields, but it was applied for gardens among wealthy individuals and royal families. Regarding the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the hanging quality was the unique characteristic that differentiated these particular gardens from the other gardens made at ground level. The hanging quality implies that somehow the gardens were suspended in the air, perhaps hanging downward from trellises or from terraces. Despite the wealth of written records, artworks, and architectural ruins from Babylon and from the larger region of Mesopotamia, almost nothing has survived with direct mention of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Most of the known references have come from external sources, such as from the Greek historians and other scholars. In the Greek world, the most influential written record about the Hanging Gardens was written about 225 BC. Philo of Byzantium, also known as Philo Mechanicus, mentioned the Hanging Gardens of Babylon as one of 7 theamata, translated as sights or things to be seen in the world. At the time, around 225 BC, Greek scholars had been producing lists of theamata as guides to the important places that people should strive to visit, experience, and appreciate during their lifetimes. Oddly enough, Philo himself probably did not visit at the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. As a bonus point of information here, I should mention that the tradition of 7 theamata aligned with the notion of the number 7 as representing the ideals of perfection among Greek philosophers, related with the 7 sacred luminaries that were visible with the naked eye in the sky, namely the sun, the moon, and the 5 visible planets of Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Many versions of the 7 theamata, or 7 wonders, had been proposed before and after Philo's list at 225 BC. Philo's listing, however, was the oldest known listing that included the Hanging Gardens, and this version became known as the standard reference that people still use today. Philo's 7 wonders included the Great Pyramid at Giza, the Colossus of Rhodes, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, the Statue of Zeus at Olympia, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. In Philo's list of 7 ancient wonders, you may have noticed that only one place was outside the familiarity of the Mediterranean of the Greek world. In this perspective, at 225 BC, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon represented an impressive achievement of engineering and artwork in the nearby yet somewhat mysterious foreign lands of Mesopotamia. In the view of Philo and his contemporaries in the Greek world at that time, Babylon was a respected ancient city-state in the southern part of Mesopotamia, the famous land between the rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates. While Philo seemingly did not visit at Babylon, he and other foreign scholars would have known about the region, for example through stories and texts that had survived from the time of Alexander the Great's conquest in 331 BC. More than 100 years prior to Philo's listing of his 7 Theamata. According to Philo's description, the gardens were built on beds of soil hanging in the air. People looked up to see the garden suspended or hanging above them. The construction involved a set of stone columns upholding an arrangement of beams made of palm tree trunks laid horizontally like a roof. This roof then supported the beds of soil that in turn supported the gardens. As a mechanical engineer, Philo called attention to the system for delivering water into the gardens in their elevated position. In this region of Mesopotamia, rainfall is notoriously sparse, and therefore the water delivery into the gardens would need to be artificial. In this regard, Philo described that somehow streams of water emerged from elevated sources due to the devices that created bends and spirals in the water to gush out higher. From those elevated points, the water then could be carried throughout the gardens via ditches and canals. Without visiting Babylon in person, Philo must have relied on information from other sources. In the Greek world at the time, Babylon was known through the writing of Alexander the Great's biographer, Cleitarchus, who wrote about Babylon and about other places in Mesopotamia during and after Alexander's conquest in 331 BC. Cleitarchus wrote in passing about the beautiful gardens in a generic sense, but he did not mention specifically about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon or their mechanical details. Cleitarchus may have used his observations at other places, such as at the city of Nineveh, as a way to build a more lively description of Babylon. Most likely, the writing from Cleitarchus in 331 BC made people in the Greek world more aware of Babylon and of Mesopotamia generally. Otherwise, the oldest external record about Babylon was from Herodotus, who lived about 484 through 425 BC, but Herodotus did not mention gardens of any kind at Babylon. These external writings about Babylon likely were influential for Philo when he created his list of 7 Theamata, but he must have obtained detailed information from other sources. One such source probably was the 3-volume set of the Babyloniaca, or History of Babylon, written by the Babylonian priest Berossus around 290 through 278 BC. In the Babyloniaca, Berossus wrote the oldest so far known written reference about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The reference does not offer much in terms of what the gardens looked like. Instead, Berossus was more concerned with the historical context and interpretive meaning of these gardens. Berossus attributed the gardens to one of the most famous kings of all time of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar II, who had ruled at 605 through 562 BC, about 300 years prior to the time of Berossus. Nebuchadnezzar II was known for commissioning lavish monuments and memorializing and praising his achievements as the king of Babylon. He was celebrated for some of the world's most impressive works, such as the Gate of Ishtar and the Walls of Babylon. The records of Nebuchadnezzar II notoriously boasted about his many accomplishments, yet none of those records mention the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The Hanging Gardens were mentioned only later by Berossus in the Babyloniaca. Berossus suggested that the Hanging Gardens may have been prompted by a woman named Amuhia or Amytis. She became married to Nebuchadnezzar II, and therefore she moved from her homeland in Media to live instead at Babylon. At Babylon, Amuhia or Amytis missed the comforts of her forested mountain home, while her homeland in Media supported a forest habitat in a rainy environment. Babylon presented a significantly drier setting where the water was restricted around the Euphrates River. The implication here is that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were constructed as a way to replicate a forested mountain, artificially within the city of Babylon. In this case, the Hanging Gardens may have involved artificial mounding or terracing, thereby giving the overall impression of a forested mountain. Somehow, the water would have been uplifted artificially to reach the height of the gardens, such as using a system as had been described later by Philo of Byzantium, referring to a system that forced water upward through spirals and twists. Curiously, the individual of Amuhia or Amytis of Media was mentioned by Berossus and other writers, only in association with the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. In the royal records of Nebuchadnezzar II, her name was either absent or mysterious. The romantic story about Amuhia or Amytis has been difficult to prove or disprove, and often the story has been viewed as based only partially on historical events. In terms of defining the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, however, the association with Nebuchadnezzar II would refer to the range of 605 through 562 BC in Babylon. In my view, the only major problem here is the fact that none of the original records from Nebuchadnezzar II had mentioned the Hanging Gardens, yet those records offered extensive details about so many other accomplishments. In particular, the records of Nebuchadnezzar II gave considerable attention to the feats of construction engineering, such as the Gate of Ishtar and the Walls of Babylon. Surely, these records would have mentioned the creation of an artificial forested mountain within the city of Babylon, or at least the records would have mentioned the ability to lift water upward to the hanging position of the gardens. The upward lifting of water was regarded by outside writers as the key feature of the Hanging Gardens. Following Philo's popular description in 225 BC of the upward lifting spiral mechanism, several other writers hit on this same point, but seemingly none of those writers actually visited to see the gardens in person. For instance, in the document known as the Bibliotheca Historica, written by Diodorus about 60 through 30 BC, Diodorus described the water delivery system made by internal tubes hidden inside the stonework of the Hanging Gardens. This description could be related with an early form of an Archimedes screw device that could lift or pump water upward through its spiral structure, very much like what was mentioned in the earlier description by Philo of Byzantium in 225 BC. Diodorus almost certainly would have known about the Archimedes screw during his time. But did Philo of Byzantium know about this device? More importantly, did the ancient Babylonians know about this device hundreds of years earlier? The Archimedes screw first was brought to attention by Archimedes of Syracuse around the year 234 BC when he visited in Egypt. Archimedes never claimed to be the inventor of this mechanism, rather he observed a screw pump that drew water from the Nile River in Egypt. The device involved a screw shape inside a long tube or pipe, turned by hand, or sometimes perhaps by other powers such as a draft animal. The turning action created enough force to move the water upward through the screw shape inside the tube. If this technology was used in Egypt as early as 234 BC, then could something similar have been used in the Hanging Gardens of Babylon? The answer to this question depends partly on when and where the gardens were constructed. The gardens must have been built prior to the time when Berossus wrote the Babylonica around 290 through 278 BC. This time frame seems reasonable for a version of the Archimedes screw in Babylon. But in fact, Berossus claimed that the gardens were constructed much earlier by Nebuchadnezzar II during his reign of 605 through 562 BC. As I already have mentioned, none of those records from the time of Nebuchadnezzar II revealed anything about these special gardens or about the extraordinary hydraulic engineering. The lack of such a record seems suspicious, given the propensity of Nebuchadnezzar II to boast about virtually everything else that he had done. A similar garden engineering feat, though, was mentioned by another famous ruler of Mesopotamia about 100 years earlier than Nebuchadnezzar II, and in an entirely different city. Sennacherib was the ruler of Assyria during 704 through 681 BC, and he famously created the hydraulic engineering landscape of Assyria and specifically at his capital city, at Nineveh. Referring to his accomplishments at Nineveh, Sennacherib was quoted in his annals. "I raised the height of the surroundings of the palace to be a wonder for all peoples. A high garden, imitating the Amanus Mountains, I laid out next to it with all kinds of aromatic plants." This description conveys the key points that would be expected of the Hanging Gardens, including an elevated garden that resembled an artificial mountain, constructed around the royal palace. This wonder for all peoples clearly was intended to impress people as a display of luxury that everyone could see at the exterior of the palace. A matching artistic representation of Sennacherib's garden at Nineveh was produced a few decades later, specifically at the North Palace of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, at some point between 669 and 631 BC. This relief carving shows a hill or small mountain outside the palace walls, supporting extensive plant growth, and including a long aqueduct system. Indeed, Sennacherib had been renowned for his engineering products of aqueducts and canals. One aqueduct was made of 2 million bricks, and it carried water across the Jarwan Valley. In this context, the creation of an impressive royal garden at Nineveh was consistent with Sennacherib's larger reputation and his list of life accomplishments. The researcher Dr. Stephanie Dalley wrote about Sennacherib's garden in her 2013 book, specifically claiming that Sennacherib's garden at Nineveh was the original version of what later came to be known as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Building on this idea, Dr. Dalley conducted experiments to ascertain if perhaps a version of Sennacherib's garden could have been built later at Babylon, for example by Nebuchadnezzar II or by another ruler at a later time. Her findings showed that the amount of water for the gardens would have been nearly impossible at Babylon, regardless of the time period. In this case, Dr. Stephanie Dalley proposed that perhaps no such gardens ever were built in Babylon, and instead Sennacherib's garden at Nineveh somehow had been renamed in history as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Most people should understand that Nineveh and Babylon were two different cities in separate parts of Mesopotamia. Nineveh was part of the Assyrian kingdom, and it sometimes was the capital city. Meanwhile, Babylon was the capital of the Babylonian kingdom. Occasionally, the Assyrians and the Babylonians had conquered parts of each other's kingdoms. During times of war and peace, they greatly influenced one another. One of those key points of influence occurred during the time of Sennacherib, when he ruled the Assyrian kingdom from his capital city at Nineveh. In 698 BC, Sennacherib's army sacked the city of Babylon. Upon returning back to Nineveh, Sennacherib adopted Babylonian names of streets, and he applied those names in the streets of Nineveh. He started using names of Babylonian gods. The Babylonian influence in Nineveh was undeniable. To some extent, people began to refer to Nineveh as if it were Babylon or a reflection of Babylon. Given this larger context from the time of Sennacherib at Nineveh, perhaps the association with Babylon can be more understandable. In this perspective, by the time when the Babylonian priest Berossos wrote about the Babyloniaca around 290 through 278 BC, the knowledge about Sennacherib's garden at Nineveh had become obscured and vague. The time gap was more than 400 years. In this context, Berossos attributed the engineering feat to Nebuchadnezzar II in Babylon. Even with this hypothetical conjecture about the transpositional renaming of the Hanging Gardens, surely the later historians, scholars, and curious travelers would have noticed a problem when they tried to look for the famous gardens in Babylon, especially after 225 BC, when Philo of Byzantium mentioned the Hanging Gardens in his list of the 7 Theamata. People must have at least attempted to see the gardens in Babylon. Did they see something resembling the famous Hanging Gardens? Whatever people saw and reported, the name of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon persisted for the next several centuries, for example as referenced by Diodorus in his Bibliotheca Historica about 60 through 30 BC. Since the late 1800s, though, archaeologists and ancient historians have searched for the traces of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. People generally had come to accept that the gardens were lost in time. Occasional claims of discovery later were proven to be incorrect or else unsubstantiated. Many different hypotheses have been proposed, but the relevant evidence consistently has been unclear. Sennacherib's garden at Nineveh very likely was the prototype or the original inspiration for the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The rest of the story, though, has been vague and questionable. In concluding this episode, I hope that I have encouraged new ways of thinking about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. What are your thoughts, and what ideas will you want to pursue? If you have not already subscribed to this YouTube channel, then please consider to do so, share with your friends, and explore more online videos with the Archaeology Studio.